I talked to, not to name them, but like the world's largest GPU provider who's building their own internal serverless platform. And I asked them, what's your cold start? And they said 5 minutes for an arbitrary container. We can do that in less than a second. We're nowhere near done. We've gotten cold start for something like Stable Diffusion, which is about 5 gigabytes, down to, 8 seconds. I'm not done until it's like a couple of seconds. We've basically been like almost 100% engineering up until recently. I don't necessarily want to advocate for it, but like, people sometimes talk about like how you need to invest in distribution and blah, blah. Like, I did not invest at all in that. My assumption was if we build a product that's good enough, like then people are going to use it. I think there's a lot of like love for technology and solving hard problems at this team.
Hello and welcome to 1 to 100, a podcast that takes you inside the most promising hypergrowth startups in a conversation with the founders themselves at the helm. Our goal is to give you the inside story alongside empirical analysis of a notable tech company that you might want to join. I'm your host, Usman Hanif, the author of the Why You Should Join newsletter. This week's 1 to 100 is all about Modal. For those tuning in, welcome to 1 to 100, where every week we sit down with the founders of some of the most notable hypergrowth startups. As always, my name is Usman. I'm one of the co-authors of Why You Should Join and the host of the podcast. Today's company, Modal Labs, is building a high-performance cloud with serverless GPU offerings. Besides growing 50x in the past year and hitting an 8-figure run rate, they're now doing more revenue each hour than they were doing all month just a year ago. Customers include large companies like Ramp and Scale, and also a host of high-profile startups like Cognition Labs, Suno, Cursor, Substack, just to name a few. I'm super excited to be chatting with Erik Bernhardsson, the company's founder and CEO. Erik, thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks. Yeah, it's so great to be here.
Awesome. Well, starting from the top, you've grown 50x this past year. If I'm correct, you guys publicly launched just this past October and are already at an 8-figure run rate. So clearly what you've built is needed. Now, when introducing the company, I gave the high-level one-liner, high-performance cloud with serverless GPU offerings. Let's unpack that a little bit. Do you mind breaking down what it is exactly that you've built? What does a developer get when they come to modal.com?
Yeah. I mean, kind of to put this in a little bit of context, because I think it's helpful. Like, I started working on this 3-4 years ago, and the original goal, and which is still very much the vision, was to build basically a new type of infrastructure provider that makes it easy to work with data, AI, and machine learning. Along the way, we realized that there's a lot of cool stuff happening in Gen AI, and GPU support matters, and we sort of, have been very focused on that over the last year or two. So today, a lot of our traction is primarily from customers who want to deploy AI models at quite large scale, particularly diffusion models like music, audio, video, image, but also, of course, like LMs, also traditional machine learning, or traditional like non-GPU, non-generative AI, as well as a long tail of other stuff. Like, people use us for protein folding or 3D rendering and all kinds of other stuff. But the core focus is sort of, take a step back, is to make it easy for developers to build AI, machine learning, and data applications.
I see. And so specifically, if a developer comes on the modal.com, what are they looking to get there? They can run code on serverless GPUs. What is the offering concretely?
Yeah, so we're a little bit more than just infrastructure, and in particular, we offer an SDK in Python. We decided pretty early on that like 95% of usage in this world, when you're looking at data, AI, machine learning, is Python. And so to make it easy, we built an SDK that makes it very easy. You just add a few lines of code, and you can take functions in Python and run them in the cloud. And we can run them fully serverlessly, which means you can take a function, deploy it in the cloud, and then basically we can scale down containers incredibly quickly in just a few seconds, which lends itself really well to a lot of sort of, GPUs are expensive. Like, you don't want to necessarily like spin up GPUs to sit there idle. We make it very easy to handle, also demand surges. Let's say deploy an app and it goes viral. We can scale that up very quickly. But really kind of also focusing on the developer experience, meaning that you can take code from your local computer and launch it in the cloud in less than a second. And having that super tight feedback loop where you can sort of iterate, run it in the cloud, iterate, run it in the cloud, like, change some stuff, run it. making that feedback loop like very almost like feel like, you want the feeling to be like almost as if you're running things locally, even though you're running things in the cloud.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll definitely dive into some of the stuff in terms of how you guys make deploying and scaling machine learning models easier. But at the most basic level, right? You mentioned that you can come and help, you guys will help developers run their code in the cloud. For those not that embedded in the space, it sounds a little similar to GCP and Lambda, right? How are you guys different just at that first level?
Yeah, totally. So let's go a little bit deeper into that. If you think of it as like sort of the stack, starting with the sort of cloud providers at the bottom, I would put us at like a layer slightly above the cloud providers. Like we aren't, necessarily like running our own hardware. We in fact use the cloud providers, several cloud providers. In fact, like we're using like 7 cloud providers or something to get maximum GPU access. Instead, we focus a lot more on the developer experience. So you mentioned Lambda, for instance. Like I've spent a bunch of time banging my head against, historically I've used, by the way, AWS for 15 years, and I love it for what it enables me to do. But it's so annoyingly hard for even like simple things like deploying a Lambda to the cloud. So that's where our developer experience really matters. Is we make it very simple. Getting started with Modal and running code in the cloud. I, you mentioned like custom code or like we're talking about code, right? And that's really the sort of emphasis of Modal is that we focus on deploying your custom code. We're not an API provider in the sense that you look at like other providers, whether it's OpenAI or doing LM or Fireworks or Together, any scale of one of those, or Replicate that offers like a very comprehensive set of APIs to run models. We're not an API provider. We focus more on like taking custom code and sticking a container or custom models, right? So the use case is a little bit different, but the power of Modal is you can run arbitrary code in the cloud, which you obviously can with the cloud providers too. But Modal makes it a lot easier to get started, and also to some extent, handles the scaling and GPU access that traditionally has been quite hard with the sort of underlying cloud providers.
Yeah, yeah. And that's actually where I was going to lead to is what do you think are the specific things that you guys have built that makes you noticeably better than perhaps some of the existing cloud providers? I completely agree. There's generally, I've used Lambda too. It's frustrating. There's all these small little things, and sometimes it's hard to articulate what it is specifically, besides the fact that this is just annoying. What are those specific things that you guys have pinpointed and really focused on being 10x better than what the current guy has?
Yeah, and kind of going back to the genesis of Modal, a big part of why I started Modal was I spent most of my career, which is now, I don't know, 25 years or something like that, like working on data, AI, machine learning stuff. Like I've done a lot of other stuff too, but that's been a big part of my career. And so I started thinking about 4 years ago, like what's a tool I would want to use, like myself, like what's like the sort of in my head, like the ideal user experience, the developer experience, like as a, as someone who's built a lot of these. And one of the things I realized pretty quickly is what I wanted that was not possible to build using existing cloud providers, as well as a lot of the software. Like using Docker or Kubernetes for something that I wanted was just not possible because this is not fast enough. Like I wanted to have this feeling where I can take code and run it in the cloud in a second. So having that super fast feedback loop, but you can't get that with Kubernetes and Docker. So pretty quickly I was like, I'm not going to be able to use this. I'm going to have to build my own thing. And then, started thinking about, okay, I'm going to have to build my own container runtime. And then realized pretty quickly also, like, how do I run container images, like arbitrary container images in the cloud very quickly? I'm probably going to have to build my own file system. And then, I can't use Kubernetes. So I'm going to have to build my own scheduler. And then, I realized like, I'm going to need a team for this. We started, started hiring up a team and building all these things. And it took a long time, but, we had to build, like I mentioned, we had to build our own file system, our own container runtime, our own scheduler, our own container image building system. And it took almost like a year and a half in order for us to get to a point where we had a really compelling demo of how all of this works. Still had like barely any revenue or any customers at that point. But that's when we started seeing a lot of traction from Gen AI. But I think also that's like what now sets us apart is like we spent a lot of time like investing in this fairly complex, low level infrastructure, most of it written in Rust for performance. And that's, something I think is very hard. And also it gives us this ability to run things serverlessly. It's not just the developer experience that we wanted. It turns out actually, in order to deliver the developer experience we wanted, we had to build very fast container cold start. But actually, it turns out to be really useful if you're doing inference because you want to have the ability to scale up and down extremely quickly. And that's sort of a second benefit of building our own container runtime is we have that ability, which is something now that we're running, very large workloads at very large scale, thousands of GPUs, et cetera. is a big part of the value proposition also to big customers.
Yeah, yeah. And sort of speaking to that, so you guys built this runtime file system, an image builder, and a job scheduler all by scratch. You mind speaking a little bit to what that even looks like, how long that takes? Was it just you? Was it Akshat was involved too, your co-founder? How did that look?
Yeah, it was initially me hacking on this for about 6 or maybe 9 months or so, and then Akshat came along and joined as a co-founder, and it was the two of us for another, I think, 6 months or so, and we started adding more people. Yeah, I mean, we built an initial version in Python, and it wasn't even Rust, but it sort of worked as like a proof of concept. We even had like a file system written in Python, which is a terrible idea, but at least it like proved out the viability. And I met with a lot of investors at that point. They were like, "Why are you like building your own stuff? You're crazy. Like you should just use like some others." But like I had a strong conviction that like investing in this like low level stuff would actually put us at an advantage. But yeah, like it's sort of it's one of those things where like I kind of feel like if you're solving for a startup to be viable in the long run, you don't want to solve a too easy problem because then like someone else can just come and build the same thing. You obviously don't want to solve a too big problem because then you're never ever going to finish it. So I think we picked a problem that had the sort of right scope. Roughly it was like 2-3 years of like hard work to get it to like to really work at scale.
And so building all of this from scratch ultimately helped with better performance, which resulted in, better cold start time, faster scale ups. Are there any benchmarking that you guys have done in terms of how much better? How do you guys measure performance and how do you sell that to developers?
I mean, just one data point is like I talked to, not to name them, but like the world's largest GPU provider who's building their own internal serverless platform. And I asked them, what's your cold start? And they said 5 minutes for an arbitrary container. We can do that in less than a second. So that means, we can take code from a user's local computer, build a container, execute that in the cloud or, in a few seconds. Or we can do another example would be like we can take code and scale it out to 100 GPUs in also something like, 5-10 seconds. If you need 1,000 GPUs, it might take a little longer because then we have to like spin up, physical hardware. But getting to that performance took us a lot of time. And by the way, we're nowhere near done. Like I think we've gotten cold start for something like Stable Diffusion, which is about 5 GB, down to I don't know 10 seconds or something like that, 8 seconds. I'm not done until it's like a couple of seconds, and I think that's going to take a lot more work. Like right now, we're looking into we built our own file system and a bunch of stuff in order to do that fast. But like another way you can do it is also you can snapshot the CPU and the GPU memory, store that to disk, and then like we can restore from like basically memory dump, and that's faster because you don't have to run all this initialization. You just have to copy like a big memory blob into CPU and GPU, and that's like a next frontier for us that we're very focused on right now, which I think is going to take it down even further.
Wow, that's amazing. And obviously this, better cold start time, the fact that you could scale up to 100 GPUs almost instantly. Are there other players out there that can do this and or are you really the only guys that can? And if so, is it just because you built all of this from scratch and aren't using any of the existing infrastructure?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Like there's no one else that could do that. I mean, I think in theory, like AWS might be able to figure it out. Like they've clearly done that for AWS Lambda. AWS Lambda is engineering wise an incredibly impressive product. Developer experience, like every other AWS product, leaves a lot to it's not the best. So who knows? Like it doesn't have GPU support though. So that's a big part of like what we do. We think about ourselves as like a serverless GPU provider, but also with a good developer experience, which is like I think a big point of differentiation for us is like it's very easy to get started, it's very easy to write code. It's like kind of just normal Python. You just write functions, and you can take any Python function, just like turn it into serverless function that runs in the cloud with GPUs that scales automatically. And so yeah, all these things like both on the SDK side and on the infrastructure side, like I think that's where we have sort of our competitive advantage.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned this earlier, almost if I'm correct, you said 90%, maybe even more of your use case right now is for, helping deploy and scale machine learning models.
Something like that. Yeah, like Gen AI in particular, like
Gen
diffusion
AI,
models.
yeah.
Like, but yeah, I mean, we have a lot of other use cases too. Like, I mean, I'd be kind of surprised to see, like, the wide range of like different things we could do. And to me, like the goal with Modal, like as I mentioned, was always to build a very general purpose platform for running almost anything in the cloud. I think focused on the types of things that data, AI, machine learning users need, which I tend to think from an infrastructure point of view has been like a somewhat underserved category, but obviously is a category that's now become like very large and has a lot of demand for compute and is also disproportionately spending a lot of money on compute. So that's sort of, how I think about like, our focus and why we've been able to build a good product.
Yeah. In terms of compute offerings, I know a lot of new startups in the space are helping you sort of deploy and scale machine learning models. A lot of them are offering models as a service, others are offering functions as a service, some are just renting you the GPU. Where do you guys kind of fit into the mix of all of this? Why do people come to Modal and not use sort of these other offerings?
I think it's developer experience and the infrastructure, like the ability for the infrastructure. Like we're a little bit above the sort of like just get a raw GPU or like a raw VM above the cloud providers, as well as like a couple of these like newfangled cloud providers that also offer sort of a similar product. You get like SSH access into like a VM with a GPU essentially, right? Like we consider ourselves to be, one level above. If I were them, like I would be somewhat nervous about, essentially there's just offering a commodity product. We think of a lot of what we provide is also the software layer on top of it. We're probably a layer below what I think of as like these model providers. Like I mentioned, these like API providers where, you can use Stable Diffusion behind an API or whatever. If I were them, I'd be worried about switching costs because, if you're calling something behind an API, the switching cost is just essentially just like, switching the endpoint URL to something else, which I would be concerned about. I think of ourselves as like solving a much harder problem, which is to run arbitrary user code at scale. Where like I think there's a lot more software differentiation, which is spending all the work we spent building our own infrastructure is what I'm talking about, and then B, the switching cost is much higher. Once we get people to use our product, it's not easy to switch to different providers. So I think that's where we found like a very strong niche. And it turns out like the big use cases, like the people that are willing to spend a lot of money running AI at scale, they all have their own custom models and their own custom workflows. And that's really where Modal excels. Is like we have the ability because you can run arbitrary code. So we make that super easy for a lot of these customers.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of, what you're touching on it a little bit here, but is that sort of what you've noticed, which is most of your, highest spenders, your biggest customers have a lot of custom code, or is it that a lot of people are still relying on just using it for quick inference and the API use case might be better? How do you think of that?
No, I mean, I'm not necessarily like we talk to a lot of customers and they're, sometimes happy to use APIs. And I always tell them like, if using one of, the API providers out there, if that works for you, you probably may not need to switch to Modal, right? Like what I think is like what ends up happening is, for instance, with LMs, a lot of people are very happy to use, one of these, LM provider behind an API, and that might work great. Like we're not necessarily trying to compete on just like raw inference. Like, just you want to use like Llama 3 behind an API. Like there's many providers out there. However, a lot of those customers eventually they end up realizing, oh, I want to fine tune my own model, or I want to use some structured output, or some, I want to do a bunch of hyperparameter tuning or something like that. Or that's when they come to Modal. Or if you look at, Stable Diffusion or something like that, like they might start out with like, vanilla SDXL, but after a while they realize like, actually, I want to use these custom adapters, or, I want to like tweak all this, like, whatever the step, there's all these like scheduling parameters, all these things. And that's when they come to Modal and, once these use cases become very important for them. And that's what we realize, like there's a lot of those people running, those types of models at scale that need their own, like they need more control, which we can offer them because it's all, it's just running arbitrary code in a box.
Yeah, you obviously offer that customizability beyond the model as a service providers, but at the same time, for people that do want to have very custom models, if they were to just rent hardware, then serving becomes pretty difficult, is what I take it, right?
Yeah, it's difficult to set everything up. B, it ends up being quite expensive in many cases because you have to provision a box that sits idle for a lot of the time, right? Like you kind of have to provision for like peak capacity. And C, let's say you end up having a surge in traffic, and your infrastructure can't handle that. Like the user experience degrades because there's no scaling, right? So we solve all of those problems, right? Like we make it a lot easier to do, and effectively we're only charging for 100% utilization, which means like we can scale up when you have a lot of traffic, but we can also scale down, including scale down to zero when there's no traffic. And so, in many cases, like people save money actually moving to Modal as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, renting the hardware loses the whole point of serverless.
Yeah, it's the opposite model, right? For a customer that has like extremely predictable, very steady traffic, it could be still more economical to rent hardware, but then they still have to build everything themselves, which is a lot of work.
Hey, 1 to 100 will be right back after a quick word from our sponsors. This episode is brought to you by WorkOS. If you're building a B2B SaaS app, at some point your customers will start asking for enterprise features like SAML authentication, SCIM provisioning, role-based access control, and audit trails. That's where WorkOS comes in, with easy-to-use and flexible APIs that help you ship enterprise features on day one without slowing down your core product development. Today, some of the hottest startups in the world are already powered by WorkOS. These include Perplexity, Vercel, Jasper, and Webflow. WorkOS also provides a generous free tier of up to 1 million monthly active users for user management, making it absolutely the perfect authentication and authorization solution for growing companies. It comes standard with rich features like bot protection, MFA, roles and permissions, and more. If you're currently looking to build SSO for your first enterprise customer, you should consider using WorkOS. Integrate in minutes and start shipping enterprise plans today.
Everyone's fighting to get these GPUs. I'm curious about how do you guys work with that? Where are you guys getting sort of your GPUs? How do the economics pan out for you guys if you're renting from other players? If you could touch that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that there's obviously been a supply demand mismatch, right? Like there's been a lot more demand than supply over for the last few years. Although I would say it's like tapering off a little bit. Like I'm starting to see, maybe supply growing faster than demand right now. So I think things are normalizing a little bit. But yeah, we use a combination of reservations in various clouds as well as a lot of spot and on-demand capacity. The other thing we do also is we're in a lot of different regions. And so we're in different cloud providers, we're in different regions. That means like we have the ability to tap a lot of different pools for capacity, which means we can typically get capacity, all over the world or all in the US or Europe or whatever, in order to, satisfy the users. Let's say a user needs like 100 A100. Like we may not all get them, get all of them in the same AZ in the same region in the same cloud provider. Like we may get them from a lot of different places, but because we can string together all these like disparate pools of supply, that's a big part of how we can allocate GPUs quickly. And then in terms of reservations versus more like on demand compute, like under the hood, we try to use. I've been joking about this sort of WeWork problem, right? Like WeWork famously signed like long-term leases with landlords and then rented them out like month to month to the tenants, which is a terrible idea, when real estate market goes against you. And so in order for us to avoid that problem, we do have a lot of reservations, some of them 1 year, some of them 3 year, but a lot of our underlying consumption is also on demand, which means that we can also scale down our pool and not pay for idle capacity. But that's the beauty of the multi-tenant model, is like because we pool all these users of Modal, the demand internally at Modal, like the sort of aggregate demand, is quite smooth. It varies a little bit like over the 24-hour cycle, but it's quite smooth and quite predictable, which means also, we even though our users individually may have very bursty workloads, on average it ends up kind of being somewhat more even. So that makes it a lot easier to manage capacity from our side.
So it sounds like you guys try to rely a lot less on reservations, or especially long-term reservations. It's just because if the market goes against you, you're caught in a tough spot. But in terms of, spot rentals and being able to manage that with like the demand you're getting, I figure this is a pretty difficult orchestration task. What have you guys built there? If you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, totally. And that's like another big technical solution that we've had to invest a lot of time in. We're actually solving a mixed integer programming problem in order to allocate cloud resources. Because basically we try to figure out, okay, like how do we minimize the total spend subject to all these constraints that we want to like place these tasks on different workers. And for AWS, for instance, like AWS has dynamic pricing for all their instance types for all their AZs. So we collect that, continuously, and you make decisions based on those prices. Other vendors have more static prices, but it's the same principle. Like we basically solve an optimization problem in order to figure out how we should allocate cloud resources and scale up and down our pool under the hood in order to run it in the most economical way to satisfy all these constraints. Like, all these users want to run their things on Modal.
Wow, that's actually really amazing. There's so much that goes into it that you don't even see from the outside.
Yeah, and it's all a bunch of fun problems that, as a nerd, like I love solving.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to dive a little bit more into the early day of the business. I know you mentioned that really the inspiration was you wanted to do some things that just weren't possible at the time, and you decided to just build it all from scratch. How'd you sort of, take this from a project into a full business and get sort of your first couple customers? What did that process look like for you?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if like I necessarily advocate like doing this for everyone, right? But like I started this during the ZERP pandemic era, so like I think it was a little bit easier in that sense because there was no problem raising money, if, like even for like vague ideas. But yeah, I mean, we spent basically at least a year without having a single customer, and then another 6 months or so having zero revenue. And I think like where that came from though, like the ability to do that was like we had a lot of confidence in that at least like what we're building made a lot of sense. We demoed it to a lot of people and they're like, whoa, this is like really cool. And I think having the experience myself of building a lot of the applications, like I kind of felt like this is a product I would have obviously wanted to use myself. So I think that was like, you know, I think about different times, on one extreme, like you sort of like have companies like database companies that basically, if you're building a database, like you basically spend like 5 years in a cave because like no one's going to use your database unless it's like it works. And it's maybe not quite that extremes, but when you're building like hard technology, like you sometimes have to spend a year, maybe 2 year, like just building the technology before you can even like sell it. So it took a long time for us to monetize it. The flip side though is like we always felt that there was a very obvious monetization strategy, like charging people to run compute in the cloud is something like there's an obvious like precedent for doing like through AWS and the other clouds. So I think there was a number of reasons like why we still felt pretty confident that like yes, like it's taking a lot of time to get revenue and find a use case, but on the other hand we had a lot of confidence that like the technology we're building made a lot of sense.
And in terms of, we mentioned them earlier, there's sort of a long list of customers, some pretty notable names there. What do you think ends up being sort of your guys' selling point? Like how does getting one of these customers even work? Do you have a full team that goes and sells there? Are you guys a team of engineers?
We basically been like almost 100% engineering up until recently. And this is like another thing. I don't necessarily want to like advocate for it, but people sometimes talk about how you need to invest in distribution and blah blah. Like I did not invest at all in that. Like I just focus on like let's only build like a product that's like really, really good. And my assumption was like if we build a product that's like, good enough, then people are gonna use it. And so the first year and a half, like that was 2 years, like we had like zero people like even thinking about marketing. Earlier this year we did hire devrel, like the focus on content and community, and more recently we hired a couple of solutions engineers, and we're also about to hire our first account executive. So we are now at the point where like we're starting to scale up the go to market. But yeah, I think a lot of it came from the fact that like Modal was always about developer experience, and so developer experience, I think it's something you almost have to like try it out to feel it. Like I struggle sometimes to explain why the developer experience is good with Modal, but when I get people to try it, or I show an example, then they kind of get it. And so a lot of that meant that like the best way to sell Modal in the early days was simply to get people to try it. And so that I think that lends itself to kind of a bottoms up motion where like we focused a lot on like make it so easy to get started, which is something, by the way, like I have a consumer background. I worked in consumer apps my whole career, or most of my career, and so I sort of think more, I think, in like in terms of like consumer onboarding and stuff like that than like a traditional B2B company. But I think that also explains like part of like how we thought about like early go to market was that let's just make it super easy to get started. Let's have this like onboarding flow that kind of feels magic. And for that reason, we didn't really necessarily need a sort of traditional like top down like enterprise sales. That's we're adding that now.
Yeah. And I guess those are healthy markers. But a lot of your distribution, like you mentioned, didn't really come from marketing. It seems it came from, honing in on this developer experience. That alone is such a tough thing to articulate, right? Like if you're sitting in a room with the team and it's like, we need to make the developer experience better. Was it just focusing a lot on the onboarding? Is it documentation? Is it better error logs? Like how do you think of developer experience?
It definitely is all of those things, but I also found that sometimes like developer experience, you can't necessarily articulate it, right? Like it's very hard to write down like a checklist of here are the things, like you kind of have to like just build it and then look at it and like feel it, right? But certainly all those things you mentioned, right? Like I think good documentation makes a huge difference. I have a lot of thoughts on like exactly what type of documentation. I think a lot of like documentation, for instance, like very bland, like they're like core concepts, and then it's like, here's how you get started. Here's a bunch of configuration. Here's a bunch of like, different options. It's like I just want to see like a hello world. I just want to, people want to see an example. Like get me started, like running some code. Like I just want to see what this does. I think error messages, like you pointed out, like I think this sort of idea of like falling into the pit of success is like the saying, like you kind of want, you want to sort of, when you do stuff like that doesn't work, you want the product to kind of nudge you back into the correct way of doing things. So like error messages, I think have a great ability. There's a great potential in like error messages to kind of push people into correct things if they're descriptive enough. Onboarding, I think investing in onboarding is super important, especially if your core product is like selling something that's, where the developer experience is so important. I think it's not just that the developer experience has to be magic. I think also the onboarding should also feel magic because it sets the expectation. And like one thing I often say is like the onboarding actually should be the product itself. Like, I think for a lot of B2B companies, like it's not just enough that the product is good. You should almost think of the like onboarding as an extension of the product. You should design the product such that the onboarding ends up, feeling easy and making it very easy to set it up. And so like one example, for instance, like Modal has zero config. There's like nothing you can configure in Modal, like, and we spend a lot of time like making it possible to run pip install and then a command that like automatically sets up the token locally, all these things.
Do you think a lot of this ultimately shines through in the product by just hiring really good people that have, a lot of craftsmanship, and that's really the way to do it?
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I think that makes it a lot easier, right? Like, yeah, yeah. Like and especially when you're building a developer product, like I think what helps a lot is that you're kind of building for your own end consumer. The people building it are themselves consumers, right? I think that makes it a lot easier in a certain way. We don't have a product team, for instance, and I don't think you need a product team if you're building a developer tool, if everyone is already kind of, thinking about the product itself. So yeah, that helps. But yeah, we've hired a lot of like really smart people. We're a bunch of like, competitive programmers. I think there's a lot of like love for technology and solving hard problems at this team.
I'm just curious, like, why do you think so much documentation and just developer experience just sucks on developer tools? Like, where do you think that comes from?
I mean, I've done it myself, right? Like, like when I've, open source things in the past, a long time ago, like that wasn't necessarily what I was like thinking about. Like when you're like, when you're like excited about building something, like you often like spend a lot more time like, thinking about the class hierarchies and like the method signatures and that kind of stuff. And then documentation ends up being this like kind of side thing you don't really think about that much. And I found that, that sort of focus on growth and commercial stuff is like often like an afterthought for a lot of technical people. And but like, like it shouldn't be, right? Like if you want people to use your product, you should think as deeply about that as you think about the product itself. Kind of going back to what I said. But I've, it certainly took me a long time to kind of realize that is like, if I want to get people to use my open source products, like I can't just like open source something and like, with horrible documentation. I also need to like make it very easy for people to get started and lay out exactly what is the value that my product is creating. How do you get started? Maybe even like say some things that it doesn't solve, or help people understand like what what's the point of this product. And I don't think, by the way, like Modal does like an amazing job here. I think there's many more things we should do on our start page, for instance. But I think like thinking about these things is so critical to all these, all these types of products.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to touch a little bit more on your own background. You mentioned you have a consumer background. More than that, previously to Modal, you were the CTO of Better.com. I believe you're one of the first 30 employees at Spotify, if I'm correct.
Something like that. Yeah, I don't know if it's exactly 30, but like something like that. I was at Spotify for 30 years, not for 30 years, for 7 years. I started a long time ago, 2000. I'm Swedish. I started when Spotify was just like a tiny Swedish startup that no one knew of, and built a music recommendation system. So I spent, most of my time, most of my 7 years, I did a bunch of other stuff too, but like most of my time there, I focused on music recommendations.
Yeah, and were there any? I mean, I'm sure there's a lot in terms of, just as you mentioned, onboarding, developer experience, etc. Also, just becoming an amazing engineer. But were there any learnings specifically that you kind of took away from those experiences that have helped you a lot in building Modal?
Totally. I mean, just to start with, like, I think, like, at a high level, like Spotify, to me, the magic moment was like you launch the app for the first time and you double click on a track and it just starts playing. And you're like, wait a minute, this is in the cloud. And that's actually, like, I think, for Modal too, like the core experience that I want people to feel, like the core magic moment is like, wait a minute, this code is running in the cloud. So I think, to me, that's like a big takeaway. And Spotify was like obsessively focused on latency, like making sure like it felt like the music was coming, streaming from local disk, but it was actually streaming from the cloud. I think there's like a lot of similarities there. I mean, I think also, like, in terms of like management and like, building companies and organizations, like Spotify did a lot of things like really well. In particular, like Spotify hired like exceptionally strong people, kind of gave them a lot of liberty to figure out themselves like what they should do. Like, I didn't know who my manager was for the first 2 years at Spotify. No one told me, which was I mean, that's a kind of a bad thing maybe, but I think it just shows how extreme like the environment at Spotify was. Like, there was like basically wasn't any management. And so, yeah, but like it kind of worked because there was a lot of smart people, and people loved the product too. And like that's kind of my experience. Is like, if you hire smart people and you hire people who care about the product, you actually don't need a lot of management. You don't need a lot of structure. And so you can sort of rely on people to self-organize and build the things that they have passion for. And it kind of works up, like, to a remarkable degree. I'm not naive. I think, obviously at some point you need to have more management structure and project stuff, project planning and all these things. But as a starting point, like, smart people and a strong mission, like, goes a very long way.
And obviously, hiring's really hard. I know you guys have done a great job. I know some members on your team and all amazing, engineers and people. How do you approach hiring? Like, how do you go about it? I know this is almost like the $1 billion question in the Valley, right? Like, how do you hire correctly? But how do you take a crack at it?
It's so hard. And like, I've hired, for 20 years professionally now, and like I've done like every mistake possible. And I think, at every point in time in my career, when I thought I figured out hiring, I realized like 3 years later, I was still making a ton of mistakes. So I think maybe to start with, you just have to be humble about your ability to assess people. It's very hard. It's very hard to assess people, especially if you're only spending a few hours on them. Like and I think, you either have to rely on like very strong, sort of introductions, or mutual connections, like vouching for a person or back channels, or a very deep technical process where you vet these people, right? Like, are they able to write code? Are they able to read code? Are they able to speak, sort of, intelligently about projects they built in the past? Do they display a sort of, passion in the right types of things that you want people to help you with? I think, just having a structured process and kind of thinking about like the traits you're looking for. I don't know. It's not easy, but it makes it easier if you start by like, having a process.
Would you say like Modo's interview process and hiring process is pretty focused on the candidate's technical abilities? Is a lot of, sort of coding challenges? What do you guys sort of rely on to hire here?
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. But that being said, like, I mean, we made exceptions to just like hire people through our network in many cases without even vetting them technically, which is kind of usually a terrible thing to do. But like, occasionally, like, there are people in our network that just have like such amazing, back channel, like people are like vouching for them and saying they're just like the best people in the world. And so in that case, like, we sometimes don't even interview people, but which like generally, again, like, I wouldn't recommend. Like, I think most cases you should have a technical structured process for everyone. And now, like, as we're sort of transitioning beyond our network and trying to hire more people that we don't know, certainly in that case, you have to have a structured process. Like, there's no exceptions, right? And it's very important that, you make it fair, you make it objective, you focus on like, how do I extract the most amount of information out of this candidate as possible? What are questions that makes the most sense? For instance, like, I have a competitive programming background, but I actually don't think it makes sense to like focus like a lot on algorithms. Like, I think that's sort of like silly memorization, and like, just to see how people like behave under pressure. I think just many other things that do a lot better. Like, one thing, for instance, like, I'm a big fan of is code reading. You give people a bunch of code snippets and just have them kind of reason about it. Like, what does it do? Is there a bug in this code? Like, how does it work? That's a format that I found, like, throughout my years. works quite well. There's many of those types of tricks I've sort of picked up along the way.
Yeah, that's awesome. And your co-founder, Akshat, I believe you previously staff software engineer at Scale. How did you guys meet? And also, how did you guys decide to sort of split up the roles? Both of you sound like phenomenal engineers, yourself included. I'm curious about what the story is there.
Yeah, I mean, that was an introduction from an investor friend that I've known for someone I know who's on the cap table that I worked with for many years, Zach Frankel. He introduced me to Akshat, and I think this is another kind of bad advice generally, but I didn't know Akshat before, so and I think it's like kind of an example of like sometimes you make exceptions, but like I was incredibly impressed with Akshat. He very mature, sort of spoke very intelligently about like what he wanted to build and what kind of company he wanted to be at, and so yeah, he joined forces. That was about 9 months in. I've been working on this for about 9 months, and now he's the CTO. So like I kind of focus more on the sort of all the other stuff like fundraising, product, like growth, sales, like all these things, and he focuses more on like the technology management. Obviously, I'm still somewhat involved in that, but he's doing a lot more of the day-to-day stuff.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. How has the whole fundraising process and the investor side been for you guys? Have you found that to be pleasant? What's your take on all of that?
I hesitate to speak to like everyone's experience because like I think it's so different. But first of all, like when we raised the money, like the first two rounds, like we did two seed rounds, like it was like in the heyday of like the sort of ZERP, like pandemic boom. So it's very easy to raise money at that point. It's probably harder now. I mean, like I think in general, like I love VCs. I think they're great people. I think that, a lot of them have like a true passion for, finding amazing companies and cool technology and investing in the right people. I think at the end of the day, like, you're aligned with VCs 99% of the time. And sometimes you're not aligned with them. Sometimes when you're like really coming down to like, negotiations about ownership percentage and like other things, like you may not be aligned with them. But I found at least like, kind of understanding that like, has helped me a lot. Like kind of understanding that like most of the time, like you're in the same boat as the VCs and they just want to help you and they just want to build a great company. And that's a fantastic role. Like, that's a fantastic relationship to have with a person.
Yeah, absolutely. As we near towards the end, I'd love to get some commentary, especially in terms of the team you guys have already built. Are there perhaps any examples that maybe exemplify what this culture is that you've built? If someone was to join Modal, what can they expect?
I talked a bit about like, sort of my experience at Spotify. And I think, it's very similar here in the sense that like I've found that smart people with a mission, like you don't have to manage them that closely up to a point, of course. Like as you get bigger, this is sort of what I think of as like necessary minimum viable bureaucracy where like you have to add a little bit of project planning and stuff like that. But like you can hold back to a remarkable degree. Like you don't need, necessarily product people too early. You certainly don't need like chiefs of staffs or, COOs. So I think that's kind of almost like a red flag with a lot of startups. What you need is like a bunch of smart engineers like building stuff. And so I think, that's a big cornerstone of aspirationally, and this again like might sound a little naive, but it's like what I aspire to get to is that everyone just comes in every morning and just asks themselves like, what can I do that adds the most business value, and then they just do that, and then at that point I'm no longer needed, which is a good thing. We're never going to get exactly to that, but I think it's worth kind of asking yourself like, how can you get as close as possible to that? Another thing I think is like super valuable in terms of, or like very critical to how I operate and how I think startups should operate is trying to make incremental improvement every day. Like I'm not a big fan of like big launches or trying to ship big things. Like I'm in a big favor of like continuous deployment. Like when you merge code, it goes into production like immediately or as soon as possible. Obviously, you should have tests, but I think almost anything, no matter how large it might seem, can always be broken down into a set of like small incremental step changes towards that. And that's also something I think is very important in terms of like developer productivity internally is having good test coverage and having a very continuous process for like delivering value. It helps you iterate very quickly and helps you ship a lot of code. Like I mean, I don't know how many thousands of PRs we ship, every year. It's like, I think this year probably shipped like 10,000 PRs, and that's a team of, I don't know, 15 engineers. So we're talking, I don't know how many, but like, the average engineer is like definitely several thousand lines of code every month. Like that rate of progress, I think comes from like kind of thinking thinking, about the developer process and the CI/CD and thinking about, the architecture. Like there's a lot of value in kind of thinking through how to structure that.
And I'm curious, what do you think is, there's obviously a lot going really well. What do you think are some of the biggest challenges potentially facing Modal? I mean, this could be on a go-to-market level. This could also be at an even more technical level, whether it could be on the orchestration side of GPUs or some of the things that you've built from scratch in terms of scaling. Like what is kind of the big challenge for Modal?
I think it's sort of a next chapter for us is like we found a lot of great traction with early stage startups who don't want to deal with the infrastructure, and they're building some amazing stuff in Gen AI, and for them, like using Modal is a no-brainer because we help them just scale and they can think about the core activities. When we talk to bigger companies, they often have existing data platforms, and so that's a little bit of a trickier sales process. It's like basically when we go to a lot of these companies, it's not just that we have to tell them why Modal is good. We also have to tell them why their existing data platform is not good enough. And that's a harder sales process. And I think that's going to take a little bit longer. I would also put in the same sort of bucket of like, go to market challenges would be certain security compliance change issues that often come up with bigger customers. And I'll actually look at Snowflake as a big source of inspiration. Snowflake and Datadog, I think, would be another example. It's like they went like maximalist, like we're going to do this in the cloud. Like we're going to, we're not going to do on-prem. We're not going to do, hybrid deployment stuff. It's all going to be on the cloud, right? And I think when you go for that model, there's no way to run Modal inside your own VPC or run Modal or run Modal in your own environment, right? Like Modal is a multi-tenant cloud provider. That is a harder. It takes longer to get customers to be comfortable with that. But like on the other hand, like I sort of look back at my career and like I remember when the cloud came and like people were like initially like, whoa, like I would never run my code in the cloud. That's crazy. And then eventually they're like, oh, I guess we can run this like R&D use cases in the cloud. And then eventually they were like, actually, let's put everything in the cloud. So I think, throughout the history of like compute in the last 20, 30 years, like we've seen a lot of these like platform shifts where like eventually people are like, yeah, I guess it's fine. Modal looks really secure. But like, it's going to take some time for us to like instill that confidence in bigger companies. Like we are a very secure platform. We spend a lot of time on security and compliance. You can actually trust us to run your workflows and your code in our environment for you, and it's actually a much better model because we're doing that. You can get access to hundreds of GPUs or thousands of GPUs instantaneously at a much lower cost. I think it's going to take a little bit of pushing to get to that point.
Yeah, yeah. And in terms of, engineering or even product wise, sort of what's next for Modal? You mentioned, thousands of lines of code being written by, every engineer every month. What are people working on? What's up next for Modal?
A lot of it right now is just scale, performance, reliability, that kind of stuff. But as we kind of look beyond that, I mean, there's a lot of, first of all, there's a lot of enterprise like security stuff that we need to do around like VPC support or SOC 2 Type 2, like stuff like that. But I don't know. I think like some other stuff that I'm really excited about is like how do we go from like beyond what we have today, which is mostly like an inference focused platform, into like how do we already do a fair amount of fine tuning, but how do we do more fine tuning? But especially how do we do more training? That's I'm really interested in. And then kind of going further back into the workflow, like how do we do more like data prep? How do we do more ETL? How do we get to that original vision that I talked about, like of being this very general purpose compute platform that where we can do the entire end-to-end workflow for machine learning, data, and AI? Because that I think at the end of the day, it's like what people want. People want a platform. They don't want to have 35 different tools that are like poorly integrated. Like they don't want to have this like one trick pony. They want to have a platform where all of their like compute needs or data munging needs like can be served. And that's the sort of original vision of Modal that I still very much believe in. That's going to take some time to get to.
Yeah, absolutely. And final thing in terms of, hiring, who are you guys looking for? I know there's a lot of engineers in the audience that tune in. What are you guys looking for? Are you hiring?
We are hiring, absolutely. We were hiring a lot of people this year. I think, kind of broadly categorizing, it's never perfect, but like, it's like two roles roughly that we need. One is, I would say, called a systems engineer. Someone is like, super interested in like file systems and Linux and containers and stuff. They don't necessarily have to have experience with all these things, but, I have to be a person who's like, presumably they would enjoy, writing high performance Rust and that kind of stuff, right? Like, even though they may not know Rust because, most people can pick it up if they're smart. So that's like one role. The other role I would say is more on the call it more like a product engineer side. Like if someone is like kind of full stack, they enjoy writing front end, they enjoy thinking about the user experience, like on the website, they love like building good looking web experiences, CSS, like HTML, obviously JavaScript, use Svelte, for instance, but smart people can pick it up. Usually it's not like a requirement. That would be the other role that we're looking for.
Yeah. And if anyone's interested, visit the website or
Modal.com.
Modal.com. Perfect. Well, Erik, thank you so much for taking the
Thank
time.
you.
It's been an absolute pleasure. For folks who haven't seen Modal yet, absolutely check them out. A little bit of a personal story. You guys are probably one of my personal favorite tools that are in my development stack. And so I highly, highly support Modal and think every developer should be using it for their cloud needs and especially GPU needs. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much. It's great.
Thanks for tuning into this week's episode of 1 to 100. Please send it to any talented operators looking to join their next company. Ratings and reviews are extremely helpful for a new podcast, and you can let us know which other companies you'd like us to profile. 1 to 100 is a podcast from the Why You Should Join newsletter and Turpentine, the podcast network behind Econ 102, Complex Systems with Patrick McKenzie, Turpentine DC, and more shows for experts by experts in tech.